We are very happy to welcome you all this evening on behalf of the Raza Foundation and the India International Center. Uh, this is our series Art Matters, which has been running for more than 2 years. And lately we converted it into a series of conversations. We have had this part of the series as it were, inaugurated by a conversation with Arpita Singh, followed by a conversation with Ashish Nandi, then a conversation with Kushan Khanna. And finally, today we have, not finally, why did I say finally? We have a conversation with Nilima Sheikh. In fact, somebody told me the other day that why do you continue to call it Art Matters? Now you should call it Artists Matter, because now you're shifting from art to artists. So maybe we would do it one day. Nilima Sheikh is an important painter of our time, and all of you who are here know her work, her struggles, her anxieties, her visions, her constant gaze on what is happening around us. She is one of those who have responded to these changes in our socio-political, cultural reality in her own way. And by doing so, she has developed a unique vision and a unique style. You can immediately identify, like you can identify Arpita Singh's paintings, you can identify a Nilima Sheikh painting, because already there is that mark. So this is and she had experimented. She's worked with theatre people, and she had worked with all kinds of experiments she had done, apart from doing, and her scrolls, what are they called? Scrolls, no? Is there some other term? No, scrolls. In about Kashmir, where in a sense her art tries to retrieve the lost sense of continuity and a pluralistic heritage, which seem to be under serious assault from many quarters these days anyway. So we have a very distinguished painter to talk to, and luckily we have two distinguished, one young distinguished, and the other somewhat senior distinguished art critics to talk to her. Latika Gupta is the younger one, and Gayatri Sinha is a very well-known art critic, and she has been a curator and has done many interesting things. And this year I may tell you somewhat publicly that in the Indian Art Fair, the Speakers Forum collapsed.
Oh, is that?
Because it was a total, I don't know, I attended 2-3 sessions and it was so boring and so poorly attended, etc. So you better take it over again and do it more properly rather than give it this. So there we are. The rules of the game are simple. The idea is to make Nilima ji talk. And these two persons who know her work, who have studied and explored her work through its many dimensions, their job is to make her talk, but also to talk themselves, I hope briefly, so that there is enough space for Nilima ji to talk.
Ashok ji, you haven't yet made it Artist Matters.
Oh.
So it's still Art Matters.
Well, hereby I announce it is Artist Matter. Anyway, we'll as we start, it will be till 7:45 that they will be talking, if that long they can, and then for 15 minutes we will have question answers from audience, which itself is so distinguished. Paramjit Singh, Ghulam Sheikh, Udhir Chandra, Gitanjali Shri, Kumar Shahani, etc., Ani Manto, my friend, and Semal Jube, Geeta Kapoor, and Leela Venkatraman, etc. So thank you very much for coming. And at the end, you will have the chance to make brief comments or ask questions. Now, you're going to do the first? No, you're going to. We go strictly by seniority in everything.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for this invitation, Ashokji. It's good to be a part of Artist Matters, Art Matters, whichever. Just a very brief introduction, just a couple of minutes, and then we will hand it over to this conversation which has been envisaged between Latika and myself. You sort of muddled along, but I hope we built up a credible structure. Nilima Sheikh has a particular place in Indian art practice and art history. She has, over a 40-year period, created a language that is extremely adroit and skillful in its manifold inclusions. Famously a graduate from MSU Baroda and one of the most distinguished artists from the school, her recent works that we can start talking about include the exhibition Each Night Put Kashmir in Your Dreams at the Art Institute, Chicago, 2014, solo exhibitions in a series at the Rabindra Bhavan 2011, Kemol Gallery Mumbai 2010, Gallery Espace 2009. Participation in the West Heavens Project 2010, Indian Moderna at Valencia 2008. These are just a few recent solo exhibitions. And she was awarded the Gagan Abani Puraskar in Shanti Niketan in 2011. Now, Nilima Sheikh, learning and painting at a time when the modernist artist in India was influenced by the schools of Paris and New York, and pushing energetically towards the rubric of the international, she turned seemingly backwards, back to the training of Shanti Niketan to explore Asian traditions and the aesthetic values of the Bengal school. But very quickly she moved far beyond these early areas of inquiry, these conversations with the artists of the past, so to speak, to create a manner of painting that, with G.M. Sheikh, is at the fountain of a new composite subcontinental practice. It is a practice that seeks to engage with the international global repository of ideas and histories, and of course the indigenous streams, but strictly on its own terms. What are these terms? These could well be a recognition of an aesthetic and political history that spans nearly 400 years and is yet vigorously political in its contemporary location. It could be in the realization or the remaking of the medieval female body, which addresses the poetics and oral histories of our times. Histories that our mothers and ourselves are familiar with or have perhaps even been born into. It could be a vision of painting as convention, but employed to address subaltern and feminist issues very much of the late 20th century. What has also given her work its contemporary valence and its edge is its political engagement, its very generous inclusiveness of labor, collaborations with artists, workers and artisans. Frankly, I don't think we have theorized this practice. We haven't given it sufficient thought, or tawajjuh as one might say, as an alternative parallel modernity. It is a form that challenges the modernist hermetic exclusion of the visual into a dominant state, but one that turns back to bring in the inclusiveness of all the arts, whether it is music or poetry or drama or architecture. I hope that these are some of the things that we will touch upon today. So in our panel, between Latika and myself, we are both interlocutors and discussants, and we'll create a broad structure whereby Latika will be the dominant discussant in the first part, and I will come in about halfway through. But we will possibly start with the first lot of questions, or do you want to look at the work in the Bombay airport? That's not on your list of inquiry? No. All right, that will come a little later. Thank you, Latika.
Thank you, Gayatri, and also Ashokji and Nilimaji for asking me to be in conversation with you. And it's also actually one of the best days to have this conversation, given your interests and also mine, because it's Losar, the new year of Buddhist. It's Losar, which is the new year of Buddhist communities across the Himalayas. So it's a wonderful day to be having this conversation. I'm really going to be talking about artists' matters. And looking at, in my questions and in the subjects that I'm going to be talking to you about the making of Nilima Sheikh and the early influences, the people she met, also come from my experiences in the same spaces. So whether it's the large cavernous art room in Modern School in Delhi or the expansive mountains of the Trans-Himalayas. And it's through her pictorial journeys with mentors, teachers, family and peers that I hope to kind of excavate this cosmopolitanism and this plurality that you champion in your work. So really going to the beginning, we need to Modern School, where you studied in Delhi, and the influence of Kaval Krishna and Devyani Krishna as teachers, who you've spoken about often. Richard Bartholomew, in the critic's eye, he was a close friend and a colleague of Kaval Krishna's, spoke of his classroom becoming a magnet for artists, an adda of sorts, where artists of the day interacted with one another and hotly debated pressing aesthetic issues. But what was it like as a student?
Take it close.
Yeah.
This is all right.
I think you've said it. It was completely a kind of space that a young student entering into a school and then coming into a space which was of another world. It was of another world. It was of a world of a space where you could rid yourself of all the rules that had been around you. It could be a space which would be in those days, it was not the usual practice to be ask young children to express themselves in the visual arts. I'm talking about the 50s here. And so it was a miraculous thing that was available to us, which later on you young people would have taken for granted. But at that time it was absolutely miraculous for us that we would be given this space. And it became more than an extension of, the art school was another part of the school, the art school and the dancing spaces that they were in, that they were entry into another world, and that world was the artist's world. And that's what I'm particularly grateful for, because it was through the convocations that I learned, got my first lessons about the pluralism of art, actually.
And
because
sorry.
Yeah.
No, I was going to say that Kaval Krishna, part of his biography that we know is that he was an avid trekker himself. He was invited to paint the coronation of the 14th Dalai Lama. It's really this sort of a world that he brought with him into this art teaching.
Yeah, absolutely. And I had the good fortune of being his daughter's classmate. So I was privy to their home as well. So, we just used to hear all these stories all the time about trekking, about Devyani's being commissioned to paint the wild flowers and flora of Sikkim, of Tibet. These were things that really, I think, looking back, I think that even I have taken this for granted and not quite understood in my later years what a formative role it had for me. And I think for so many of us, there are so many of us who would acknowledge this, Rajiv Sethi, Gita, so many others who would now be able to see
and
that.
You were also, of course, learning how to dance in school under Narendra Sharma, who was, of course, a part of IPTA in the 1940s, and about whom you wrote in a volume commemorating Modern School's 75th year.
Yeah.
You wrote of Narendra Sharma as being, and I quote you here, progressive and secular, engaging through his art in the quests and frustrations of contemporary society, and the existential angst of the individual, to a modern syncretic language and in locating tradition to service the future constructively. Now, I find it almost, it's lovely because what you write about Narendra Sharma could be said about your own practice as well.
So you see.
And again, then, to go back to the mountains, you belong to a family of doctors, both your parents are doctors.
Yeah.
And when we met last week, you were speaking about the many, many treks that you made every single year with your mother.
Both my parents, but it was my mother who was the leader of the group. So it would be the four of us, my sister, me, and during my young days, till I went away to Baroda to study, actually, more or less till then, we used to make these regular trips to the mountains. We also have a home in the hills in Himachal and Dalhousie. So that was like, a space which was comfort zone as well as adventure zone. But in some ways, traveling through Kashmir particularly, but also various parts of the Western Himalayas, we encountered and walking through them. It was a time when, it was perhaps every middle class Indian's dream to have a vacation in the hills. So that way it was not unusual in that sense. But I think because of my mother's slightly crazy kind of determination to scale the mountains and to go as far as she could within the resources she could muster, we saw these mountains in a way that I feel very especially privileged to have been able to do. And to walk through valley after valley is an experience which I think has been very pretty integral to my art practice now.
Yeah, and I remember when we were speaking about this last week, you were talking about this encounter with landscapes, but both in the valleys of Kashmir and also the mountains of Lahore and Spiti. And it was very unusual for people to be traipsing around those mountains. It was very recently, in fact.
Yeah, we used to travel with the Gujjar nomads whom we used to employ as sort of guides and tent carriers, and we used to, we had the good fortune of knowing one or two people in Kashmir who were in a position to be able to guide us about where to go. But it was a very, very special time.
So, but two questions really. One is, what were the different sorts of cultural worlds that you encountered in these yearly expeditions? And the second is that walking in the mountains, and also you mentioned, you cross from one valley into another in Kashmir, and each one is different. What did it do to your idea of landscape? You can't really speak of a horizon line as such because it's constantly shifting with every step that you take in the mountains. So how do you feel that sort of informed your understanding of space, really?
I think in some ways, perhaps, I've been always trying to grapple with the idea of the mountains and particularly of Kashmir. But I think it's actually when I met paintings which have been painted by the Persian painters or by the Mughals or by people who painted the Pahari painters, that I began to understand that I could use these experiences into structuring a language of my own. And I think that so these were sort of two histories that I was weaving together. The memory of my travels and the history that was available for me, which I was quite independently, passionately loved, irrespective of whether I had, had an experience of the mountains or not. So where does that go from?
Yeah. No, but then engaging with history, because you didn't go off to art school right after finishing school. You went and studied history in Delhi University. And do you feel that kind of informed your practice in a foundational base for what would later become a major preoccupation with excavating different sorts of pictorial histories?
It did in a way, but I think that history was taught in a fairly conservative way when I was there. It changed fairly soon after. And I did enjoy my time in the Delhi University, but I don't think that I channelized it very much into my own work. But it was studying art history in Baroda that made the big difference. Of course, the period of having done history in Delhi would have led to a better understanding of the art history that I was learning when I went to.
Right. And you were in Baroda you were studying in Baroda, you were in Baroda much longer, between 1965 and 1971. And you studied directly under K.G. Subramaniam. At a time when a new language of modernism was being developed, but again in Baroda, it was via tradition in many ways. So, for instance, Anshuman Das Gupta has described K.G.'s pedagogy quite beautifully, and he writes that his energies were directed at creating an interface between traditional and contemporary art languages. And this was the beginning of the linguistic turn in institutionalized art and in pedagogy in the wider art scene within the post-independence framework. And I'd like to stick with this idea of the linguistic turn as well, where K.G.'s ideas were built around the possibility of communication, which, while keeping the context alive, would allow a modernist to traverse across cultures, or rather cultural differences, through an awareness of linguistic nuances. And here then to work with the idea of syntax or language in your art. Could you talk about your Baroda years and also then learning with K.G. Subramaniam and the sort of encounters that you were having with art history?
My Baroda years would take a lot of talking to complete, but I'll talk first about Subramaniam, who was, and I think this whole question of syntax and language is the key to it. I mean, I had many influences while I was in Baroda, but the person who actually helped me understand grammar language was Subramaniam. I mean, it is from him that I understood, through his studio instruction as well as through his lectures, actually more through his studio instructions, that
it's fine, it's okay. Just hold it close.
That I think that I'm trying to think where it started from. Actually, there was an attitude in Baroda which later on I question, is that you have to unlearn everything you know. You have to start from the beginning, and whether that was, I mean, I can't say now whether that was useful for me or not, but it gave a rigor. It gave a rigor that you start from the bottom. And there was this whole thing about you leave your fanciful ideas behind you for the moment, you know, and you deal with that later. And that was the kind of. So the instructions were all and they were derived also from the Bauhaus traditions, as well as from the kind of understanding of various kinds of structuring that different kinds of media and materials could lead to. And I think that's where Subramaniam's influence is perhaps the largest.
Right, and your own MA dissertation was, of course, a critique of the way modernism was developing, or the idea of modernism that was kind of unfurling at that time. And I remember again you were mentioning that in terms of the reception to your own work, there were varying sorts of responses. So one was, of course, the older generation or other teachers who were critical of the sort of practice that you were doing. So if you could talk a little bit about that.
It wouldn't so much be other, I think that when I came out into a professional area and I had begun to exhibit, that I would then begin to face critiques which were, like I mentioned to you last time, was that they would be questioning the way that I was trying to draw. They would be questioning the kind of content that I was dealing with. But it was this critique actually, more than the kind of critique that I had got in Baroda, that helped me formulate actually what I wanted to resist and what I wanted to do in a way that I mean, my whole idea when you see, I was at the kind of drawing that we were encouraged to do in art school by, say, Subramaniam, or before that by N.S. Bendre. I was fairly adept. But then when it came to wanting to paint the way I was wanting to paint, in the way that I was looking at the art which inspired me around me, that I was wanting to take lessons from there, I realized that once again I would have to unlearn and learn another kind of drawing. And that became, I think it's been an ongoing exercise for me ever since. And this was the beginning, and I think that criticism about the weakness of the drawing or things that I received from artists who were very much from a tradition of a certain mastery of a drawing, and there was of course, a male notion, understanding of drawing in those days very much. And so it helped me, this critique helped me say, stick on to what I was trying to do, And I think drawing that way has been for me right from the days of Baroda. I mean, it's been a way of kind of finding language for myself. And I think one person I should mention here is Bhupen. That I think has been, this appreciation of Bhupen, that personal appreciation, but also the admiration that was already developed for him, gave one a liberty, gave one courage. And though one didn't necessarily follow his path, but it gave one the courage to try and follow paths that were not were of one's own.
And here, I mean, it leads directly to my next question, because initially, of course, you were talking about drawing or a particular stylistic critique, or the way your style was developing or the gesture was. But then there was also your personal life, and here you're talking about Bhupen Kakkar, and having your personal life seep into your work in a way that perhaps wasn't necessarily celebrated at that time.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, like, there would be senior artists who once told me very nicely, affectionately and kindly that, Nilima, you're painting very well, but why do you put your children into it? And that kind of, made me decide that, well, yes, I want to put my children into it. And, those were also ways of my finding my femininity also, that, you can put your whatever lovers and still lives or whatever you want to into it. Why can't I put my children into my painting?
And again, you had mentioned somewhere that then encountering the very, very rich miniature tradition, medieval miniatures, whether it's Mughal or Rajput, allowed you, not allowed you, but that's where you really felt that you had found a pictorial resonance with the sort of very personal themes that you were working with at that time as well. So what was it about miniature painting, and especially you have mentioned Nensuk as well, as being somebody whose work you really look to?
I think Pahari painting particularly, in those early years, was very useful for me in the way that I could translate the grammar into my life in the neighborhood spaces, sort of with my children. We lived in a place which was quite had a suburban quality because there was a big kind of unkept garden in front of it, the university accommodation, and I think that the Pahari painting gave me a lot of clues. Other kinds of things of looking at the minute, for instance, or looking at things that grow, looking at things that you show children, all these things that then became a part of looking at the art history that I was beginning to love, and looking at the life around me began to get intertwined into each other. And there would often be paintings that I would be doing sort of for my children and their friends, in the sense that how many squirrels can you spot on this branch? Sort of there was that factor that was working into it.
And of course, an integral part of being in Baroda was the idea of the adda. So between Baroda and Kasauli and elsewhere, what role did all these interactions with your peers play? In Kasauli, for instance, in 1976, Vivan Sundaram and Geeta Kapoor set up perhaps the first artist-led international sort of residency space, where it wouldn't just be visual artists, but writers, theatre practitioners, playwrights, all coming together, living together and formulating their ideas, thrashing out ideas as well. So what was the role of this adda and that sort of peer interaction?
Of course, that was a very major influence. But right from the time of Baroda, I mean, our home, Ghulam was a teacher for many years at the Faculty of Fine Arts, and our home was an extension of the college, and we would have, it would be daily adda. So, one grew up with that. I was younger than Ghulam, and I was, became friends with many of his friends who were a good bit older. Bhupen was older. And so they already had that kind of way, sort of our homes being a place for interchange was already a given by the time I came into Ghulam's life. And that became then more formalized and institutionalized in that way. The Kasoli workshops were very much part of it. The graphic workshops that Vivan organized in Baroda
So
allowed
we have two pictures from the Kasoli workshops up on the screen, and these are from the Asia Art Archive. Yeah.
Well, we did other things also at these workshops. And besides that, there was another workshop there were two other workshops at Kasoli which have contributed quite significantly to my life, and one of them was the one with the German artists.
So I have one earlier. So this is from
that was in the I think early 80s. It was 83 perhaps, where this had been an exchange between which Vivan had organized and spearheaded between German artists, and we visited them first in Germany, and these were artists who were also quite interested in art history. So it was quite marvelous to be looking at German and European and then Italian painting in their presence, in their company. And then they visited us, and we had a workshop at Kasoli. So this was a very major, it was a moment where a lot of ideas and things began to get exchanged.
Right, and other, of course, major part of the development of your vocabulary has been the encounters with, traveling in India, looking at murals, but also coming across perhaps the best examples of miniature painting as you traveled with Ghulam Bhai in museums across the world, and his interest in art history. So good.
And that would be very much so all over India. I mean, because of Ghulam, we traveled so much, and because we wanted to look at the paintings that we loved in books, to see them actually. But it's not just in India, it was wherever we could go, and Ghulam had this enormous love for Italy. Even while he was teaching me, I had been familiar with that. But then I got an opportunity to go and visit all these places with him, the places which became for many of us, for a lot of us, like pilgrimages.
Of course, I have this image up, which was painted in 2007 by Gayatri, and it's I don't know. It's not based on actual fact, but it's and this is of course after Bhupen's passing, but located on Chowpatty Beach, fairly close to where he lived. And really all the players of the Adda of the time that this practice was developing, but in 2007. But then moving on to talking about, again, as Ashokji had mentioned initially in his introduction, is art history as resource and the question of influence. And this is something that you had written, and it's fantastic, where you are really going against the grain of all the tropes that were being critiqued at that point, where you say illustration is a bad word in the modernist lexicon, so you need to open that up. Sentiment is a bad word, you open that up. Maybe even narrative is a bad word, you open that up too. You must constantly be recharging terminology and reinvesting stereotype. Cliches need to be reread, reactivated, and not discarded as dead wood. The loss otherwise would only be yours. And through your practice, this is exactly what you've done. And you mentioned that you were reading Kumaraswamy early on as well, and that idea of Asia opened up for you at that point via Kumaraswamy's essays and books.
Very much, yeah. Kumaraswamy was sort of reading material for us when we were studying, so it was not unusual that I would have studied that. But I think for me, Kumaraswamy acquired at that time a very major significance, of an understanding, because I used to find the rest of the way that Indian aesthetics was came down was a bit far removed from me. It wasn't accessible to me as a student. But Kumaraswamy was like I would read it and I would force other people to read it and try to I believed very much. I mean, a lot of my ideas came from things that we might have critiqued later, but at that time they were very significant.
Right, and of course, purely pictorially, for instance, I've got this image up behind you. So to the extreme left, that's a picture of the entire scroll. In the middle is a detail from that scroll, and on the right is a painting by Nilima, who you've already spoken about, of Raja Balwant Singh writing a letter. But also then simultaneously you have, for instance, 8th century Central Asian paintings, Chinese mural paintings, Tibetan art, Himalayan art, motifs and reconfigured symbolism in your paintings that recover cosmopolitan histories at the time that these were made.
Yeah.
And they speak of possibilities that have in some ways been violently rendered impossible today, or at least in our imaginations with current politics. And places that now seem remote or conservative were once marketplaces for traders, missionaries and adventurers from across the globe. I mean, as an instance, and I know this because I'm doing a project in Kargil, which today is seen as completely backward, or the only reason it's a part of popular imagination is because of the war in '99. But for instance, in a trader's caravanserai and in the shops there, things like Japanese toothbrushes called Majnu, which were made specifically for the Indian market.
Really?
American luxury soap, Italian buttons and shoelaces, German torches and lamps have been recovered. And these speak of histories, this material culture, and of course then art historical evidence in the form of imagery, speak of histories which are entirely lost to us today. So in works such as this, Travel Routes, which you made in 2007, fairly recent, you evoke these histories, both in the content but also pictorially, where you sense the vocabulary that existed in the 8th century. But then how do you reconcile, let's say, this pictorial grammar with the histories that these motifs may have carried at that point as well in your work, which you address contemporary concerns with?
I think my main, to visit China was always a dream. And so I'd say that my visits to China was fulfillment of that, and I was looking at it. The first time I went, which was soon after Tiananmen, I think that one got to see a life in China at that time, which was changing very much. These are short trips you make. You don't really kind of get to meet a lot of people whom you could talk to. But there was this moment of change, and there was a critique within the community. Even the guide that we had, who had been, she was very well versed in art history, but she had been in the Cultural Revolution. She had been an activist in northern China, and who now had gone through this long journey of coming right back to critique it, and was looking afresh with us at art historical center. So in that sense it was a special time, because you felt that you were discovering things along with them. The later trips one has made to, again, with the notion of going to pilgrimage sites of paintings you love, or of a culture you love. And I have to confess that I've been fairly selective in the way that I have looked at my interest in China.
To me.
Thank you, Latika. Actually, I want to respond to this last point. I'm not quite sure that I completely agree that there is a sense of loss because trade routes have become more restrictive, perhaps, or as you suggest. I think there is an expansion. your figures for something like the 11th century would have been about 10,000 Chinese monks coming as far down as Kerala. You would know more about it because you're studying this. I'm not a student of that. But the number of Indians traveling to China would have increased tremendously in our present time. So in term, there would be a shift in trade routes. But I think the cultural engagements have become more politically determined. I mean, I'm referring specifically to something like West Heavens, which is based on the premise of the exclusion of the West. I don't think, and so there is a direct dialogue that Johnson Chang, Ghulam Sheikh, Gao Shiming, etc. have set up, Ashish Gandhi have set up, where there is a China-India dialogue, but at the basic premise is the exclusion of the West. I think that's a very important position, which perhaps was not being exercised along the earlier trade and cultural routes. I don't know, but then we could perhaps talk about that. One of the paintings you referred to is what I'm going to come back to, so that's where we are. Should I switch? And you'll be able to see it?
Yeah.
Which is this button, which will...
So the one of
This one?
the arrows, the left arrow and the right arrow.
My conversation with Nilima ji, I hope, is going to be looking at the work, because there seems to be such a massive amount of material that has been included. The sweep is so vast that we're possibly not going to do much justice in half an hour, but I'm going to try. This is a work that Latika also showed, a river carrying across, leaving behind, of 2001, and this is a detail. I was very interested in this work because to look at, say, maybe two aspects of it. This is a greater detail, this is the first detail. When you as an artist start to engage with histories and also legends are a very important part of the way your mind is approaching history also in a certain sense, but also myth making, and through myth making a certain pictorial frame. The fact that you create a cartography for the legend, this is an entire map supposedly with the rivers of the Punjab, and you embed on it perhaps this is like popular painting, Sasi Punnu, Sohini Mahiwal, etc. What was coming to your mind when you were creating this kind of sort of cartography, so to speak, this kind of movement, that with the flow and ebb of the river, there are these climactic moments from these love legends which you sort of wanted to create in the landscape, embedded, even textually?
Perhaps this comes from a little bit what we talked about earlier, about somehow the retrieval of say a legend. Somehow always I have the desire to locate it, and travel, and especially travel on foot, somehow had quite a lot to do with it, of laying it out for yourself like a map. Whether it was, there's one painting I've done which was a little later than this, in 2003, which is called Valley, and we don't have it here, but I have actually tried to lay out the map of the Valley of Kashmir as I knew through the travels that I made. Now these might not be necessarily, they're coded. I think it was necessary for me to develop some codes.
You mean like a personal conversation with yourself?
And a personal,
symbolic
the way that
embedding.
There's a code there which is accessible to the viewer if they want to see it, but it's not. It's within. It's embedded within it, but it doesn't need to be the primary overarching kind of information about the work.
Chenab, the similar thing. This is the legend of Soni, which you spoke of having a particular predilection for, something that you were deeply attached to. What was it that attracted you so much to this that you?
I think it started off. I always loved the legend, but once singing, hearing Madan sing Soni, sparked off a landscape in my mind, and there was a lot of. Then I started reading. And so Sony was a very favorite person, and I identified with it because I was fond of swimming too. So,
Kumkum Sanghari has spoken of your work as located in an Eurasian pre-national cosmopolitanism. It's a very interesting thing. Now, if we look at the kind of poets you've been interested in, through your engagement with legends, Waris Shah, Bulle Shah, Bhitai, the Sindhi poet who actually collates Soni Mahiwal, Sasi Punnu, and creates a whole genealogy of legends of the time. Historically speaking, this is a period that stretches from about 1650 to the 18th century, or maybe the end of the 18th, early 19th century. This is obviously a very rich aesthetic field, and it also broadly relates to your interest in Eastern painting. So it's not only a pre-national cosmopolitanism, it's a pre-modern cosmopolitanism. What was it that drew you to this time? There is a complete erasure of the immediate colonial. And this is an interesting thing because maybe the next question can see how you then embed other aspects of the domestic. But what was it about this period? Was it because this is where the miniature is located? As an aesthetic field, it offered you great riches. What would be your...
all these things, certainly, both these things. The fact that the paintings of this period were also the paintings that I was learning most from. But maybe it would also be like, I think I was following tax again, it's older tax that one was picking up from the Shantiniketan lineage of, somehow wanting to believe in the fact that there could be an Asian understanding of things, sort of in an Asian understanding of a cosmopolitanism.
This is a very interesting thing. It seems to come up maybe with huge lapses in the middle. You would have the early Okakura tension, Sun Yat-sen, Rabindranath Tagore, and to a certain extent Abanindranath and Nandalal. That would be the period of the late 1890s to about 1910, 15, 20. And then there is a big gap. Then it comes about again perhaps in the 50s. There is an invocation in Baroda of bringing Japanese artists, etc., but of a modernist sensibility, like Abe. And then you come back into the immediate period where there is again a reworking of perhaps even an Asian critical space, an Asian political and an Asian economic space. You believe this is a valid,
I think this is a
valid space. Have you been able to draw any dialogues through the experience of West Heavens, for instance, with artists of China or Japan or China and back to India? I mean, what is the looping of the imagination that a contact or a confabulation, a creative confabulation like this
It's difficult for me to formulate it at this point, but it's sort of been a beginning. I don't think, it's just that for the first time that Indian and Chinese artists were having even the patience to look at each other's work with care and respond to it. And there were a lot of things that one loved and responded to and all that. So I think, it's too early for me to say yet about how it would, develop in my work. But I think that it is politically a very important thing that has happened.
Right. It's interesting, no? Your work was not seen as political, but it is so highly charged. I'm asking you also about this time because there seems to be an interest in a reverse kind of an embedding. This is something that Kaushik has also written about. It's a sort of a reverse osmotic process of returning the present into the past. So whatever is affective, for instance, Vidya Rao here singing the Thumri, your children in Dalhousie, the reverse embedding into a manner of painting or an aesthetic field which could of course be evocative of the past, and which also tears away the debris, the detritus of the everyday. It's a very pure space that it's almost like a gift that you confer on what has obviously been something of great positivity in your own personal life?
I think at that time it was Ashish Rajadaksh, who once said something that I hadn't thought of, that I mean it's a way of not just about nurture, but about protection. I mean, he didn't put it quite in those words, but...
Yeah, it is an embedding in this wonderful pure space that you bring these works into. It's also your mother and her association. So the extension of the domestic and the familial into larger and larger landscapes. Nilima ji, I'm very taken with this particular kind of format, which seems to be as if a sheet of paper were almost stapled on to...
one of the papers is a collage.
These are
one of them. One of them is the lightest paper is stuck on.
Yeah,
the rest of it is...
This is an interesting kind of a method. It is literally the embedding of perhaps in an existing idealized space and then the reversion, so to speak, of the figure. This is something you... It's literally something lifted out of the sketchbook perhaps into something that's much more formally constructed.
Sometimes it's a way of... I think for me it is more than that. It is a way of finding an autonomy for the body. You know, for finding an autonomy for them, that they exist in that space and in another space and in another space. That it's not just within that, they're not fixed within that picture. And I think this has gradually, for me, been very important to how to give the bodies that I make or the figures that I paint the autonomy that they deserve, or that through which they can become functional in more than one way.
I want very much to be able to look at the female form, the way you construct it, particularly the draping and the undraping, and what you consider as the appropriate moment. Here, for instance, perhaps is this garden in the mountains, is this an image of your mother?
Yes, it is.
That is an image of your mother, but one of perhaps something that can suggest rest or death.
Death.
This
well,
was
rest and death.
Rest and death. And when we looked at the drape form, there is a great formality in some of the work that you bring about. And I was wondering about the drapery that starts to evolve in immediately pre and post independence India of the draped figure, how it is arrived at. And we thought a lot about the drapery of Ravi Verma, but also the North Indian figure, how it needed to be clothed. And some of the kinds of figures that we can look at, which seem to share a sort of sense of the female form under duress. Mourners by Prannath Magu, Satish Gujral, and then we come to when Champa grew up. There is a sort of there is a very protective mode of rendering, as if gustakh nazar se bacha ke rakhna almost. There is a sense of that, and then of course the violation, that it is because of the nature of the protective nature of the drapery that the violation becomes even more particular. Just to look at these, I was interested in how you arrived at it, and if you in your essay you said about Amrita Shergill, for a woman painting in India, Amrita Shergill is legacy. Were there other sources when you were making the female form, and you make it so abundantly? Were there other sources that you were particularly taking from what we might recognize of the forms that we can?
Well, in this set of paintings, when Champa grew up, there are quite diverse sources, even though the structuring of them perhaps would be sometimes somewhere from manuscript painting, sometimes from a kind of imakimono format, a Japanese imakimono format of the kind of division of verticals and horizontals within the pictorial space. But also within that, I have worked into other. There are then, like say for instance, this was one of the inspirations behind this painting was San Marco flagellation of the Christ, where only the implements of torture are used and not the actual action of torture. So these are very different influences that came, but there is also perhaps an overarching interest in the interest, or maybe it was and I think interest is the wrong word. Maybe it was a kind of something some kalam that I was trying to form, which came a lot from Pahari paintings, I think, and particularly, I mean, I would be directly inspired by a Nim Kalam idea, and which is the drawn within which is something that has remained with me for.
And it helps to create a sort of a typology of the woman under duress, which you can then access over a very long arc, partition, Champa, certainly Gujarat, and other such narratives. This kind of body. But then there is also the unclothed body, and you mentioned the influence of Suzi Taru when she brings out that wonderful double volume Women Writing in India, and the fact that these translations afford this great freedom. I'm very interested in what you've done. I mean, we've taken the diptych exactly as it is from your book. This is perhaps not how it is perhaps in the larger work, or is it exactly? It is exactly like this. So the abstracting of the form, I mean, both these works are speaking of Akka. And this is also an older genealogy of textuality in India, which we tend to ignore, because by about the 2nd or the 3rd century, there was obviously, as Hinduism becomes more and more entrenched, there is a division that we see between Shaivism, Vaishnavism and Shaktism, and the attributes of Shiva and Vishnu as they are decided. One of the attributes of the female or the feminine is text, and this is what she wears, the mala is the 51 aksharas, etc. And this is repeated again and again, the possession of text as a female property. So for you to be accessing these images through text and then giving them a form is very interesting. What were you looking at? I was very interested to know how you come across the image of Akka. Is it a construction? Is it a reference?
It is a construction, because the kind of images that I have had been able to see of Akka are usually the popular images. There are no older images that are available to one. And those are, like, she's often depicted like a little bear with a whole lot of hair, or, it's not necessarily, there's also a way of clothing her through her hair, which has been part of it, which have been very fascinating on their own. But here I think it's a construction. It wasn't specifically an image that I had thought of using.
And the abstraction, that complete negation of the form, it's almost like a whirlwind. But you also spoke about breast cancer. And the fact that perhaps you wanted to give it a form, this radical mastectomy, the removing of the breast.
True.
And the fact that one's friends or one's family suffers this.
Yeah, I mean, it was a time when somehow one had become much more aware of what breast cancer was doing to women's bodies. And I'd been through the experience of a friend who had been suffering from it and been very close to her. So, I mean, it was there was, in a sense, there was a mutilation of the body and an empowering of the body at the same time, which was it was quite moving, but it was also quite something that I didn't expect to be there so close to me.
To come to these kinds of forms which you use so abundantly, these forms that seem to move, especially water bodies, right across the extent of the scroll or the work. The work is imbued. You just said this in your conversation with Latika, which was beautiful. you want to be able to paint things that grow and which you can show to children almost as nascence. There is a sense of immanence or nascence in the work itself or in the object, and that's certainly in the water that you paint. But then with this comes associations of migration, movement, expulsion, exile, and lamentation in a certain sense. I was wondering if you might want to speak the form of the Shamiana itself, intensely theatrical, but one of the medium of the nomad, the unsettled, so to speak, the gypsies on the surface of the world. I wanted you to be able to perhaps comment on this.
Shamiana was conceived as a space for performance, I suppose, but it was in a way this whole notion of being Khanavadosh, being able to pack up and go, despite its great, my desire to ornament the space. Besides tell the stories, to ornament the space. So in the outer the scrolls were painted on both sides, and on the outside I painted journeys which were of Akka or of Soni or of some Sasipunnu or various journeys like that. And the inside was painted with the more intimate domestic life of the woman, with childbirth as one of the main motives.
Yes.
There was no occasion to be able to show it the other way, but for me that was a possibility, that it should be able to be not necessarily that the internal life is inside.
So the selection of the legendary figure is also because he or she can bear the weight of these multiple interpretations of being the wanderer, the exile.
Yes, I think that's the great...
and the unlocated, so to speak, always in flux, which is how you paint them.
Which perhaps when you use a figure out of literature or out of legend or out of some traditional resource, you have the fortune of they're carrying that history, and then of course what you do with it is another matter, but you have that fortune.
These are wonderful bodies of work of moving in rivers. I've just seen another painting by a much younger person called Prajakta Potnis, who on a bed paints an entire landscape, and here you've sort of conferred it on this boat.
This is a part quotation. I'm usually a bit not very faithful in my quotations, but this is a very mysterious Pahari drawing, which has a big boat and all kinds of things being carried on it, and including armies and mountains and landscapes and elephants and things. So this is a part quotation. Part quotation.
Wonderful. I'm very taken by all this work, so I greedily put it all in lal mark. And then to come to something which is obviously a position you've taken with the artisan, the mazdoor, the tarkhan, the badhai, the julaha, the weaver, the carpenter, the mason, the city builder, the one who lives outside the city in the chowni, in the cantonments, but is the great empire builder. There is this reading by Irfan Habib, which is a wonderful one because he sees these figures as deeply empowered, not as low in the social scale, but as those that actually represent a settled economy in the making of the cities, in their so whether it was under the Sultanate rule or in the later empires that come up in North India, Irfan Habib actually argues that these were periods of replenishment. I was interested in your reading of the artisan because you have imbued this figure with great dynamism in your work, and he occupies a huge amount of space.
I think this interest started quite a long time ago. Perhaps one of the earliest images I painted of somebody at work at a sort of was, this amazing workshop that we had in Kasoli, where Anuradha Kapoor had organized a big workshop. We had a lot of us, various people, including Gitanjali, who was sitting there. It was a feminist workshop, and we were devising plays over there. And one of the people who was there as a constant was a little tailor who would be sitting in the living room, because that's the only space that there was available for him, stitching away. And for me, he sort of became, in a way, the hero of the story. That we were doing these amazing things. We were talking about all kinds of things. There were activists, there were theatre people, and there was this little guy who was just solidly going on. So I think that for me that became quite an important thing. But after that, these particular paintings are very specific.
Kashmir?
There was a manuscript that I came across in the British Library, and it was a 19th century manuscript about the professions of Kashmir. It was done in a very cursive hand, and done obviously quite a local hand that was used. So I've changed it quite fairly completely, and it's only the idea that comes from there. But in a way it has been my, there's no way that I can have the verve of that cursive hand. But I sort of feel that my own ambivalences can do something about it. So.
Yeah, it's also like a riposte or to the colonial making of the professions and the occupations of India, which is, you see that in many forms in dioramas across museums of India. It's a wonderful, absolutely wonderful work. Rozgar. And I think what one looks at in the length and the breadth of the work, and the fact that you work like a miniaturist but also on great scale, but there is an overriding temper, and that is the engagement with love. Mm-hmm. The overriding emotion, the bhav, the ras is of engagement with the narratives of love, the sheer palpability, if you like, of the emotion, and with it its many attendant emotions of lamentation, loss, and longing. Yeah. And of course, the obvious, because because of this great genealogy that you've excavated for yourself of the miniature, taken it so much beyond of Baramas, of Naika Bhed. Then the question is, what were you taking, what were you giving, what were you excluding? This is something very important happening in the making of a completely contemporary miniature painting style, but with a very strong emphasis on bhav.
I'm grateful for you for thinking that through for me. I don't know whether there's very much more that I could say about that, but it would sound, whatever I would have to say would sound too cliched. I can't really respond to that at present. It's
maybe we can show some images. Latika, sorry, I seem to be.
No.
In this particular work, it looked as if you were going to take it into another direction, the way you've created these heavenly figures. And finally, tree planter from Kashmir. I'm on my last couple of minutes, so I should wind down, but this is obviously an area of intense political engagement. What we don't show in this work is, of course, the body that might be, this looks like a picnic under the tree. It's very much like a Mughal painting of the boy falling off the tree at the moment of hilarity, at the centrality of the tree. And here it looks like another work that you've done called Picnic. But this is a family in mourning, because one of their family members has to be buried. And there are just two works what happened that day. and the extreme violence even in the everyday. Would you like to comment on your engagement with Kashmir and what you project into the future perhaps? How do you see this from the present into the future? How does it work as a narrative within yourself?
I think that every phase of the works that I've done on Kashmir, I feel that, well, now I've said more or less what I want to do, and then I come across something else which gives me another way of... I mean, it's not that it will never be that I'm done with Kashmir, but for me to find a way of entering each time has to have some reason, some motive. And so the moment the last lot of work that I did, one of which we don't have images of over here, were from a takeaway from the Rozgar series into something that I called Hunarmand, which is again a major tribute to the artisan of Shri. And then from there, the next step was to actually work with them. I work with the craftspeople of Srinagar, which I did in this amazing opportunity. I got to work at the airport with under Rajiv Sethi's curatorial effort. And in that, simply because there's a scale of it, and simply because it was a space which would require materials other than what the ones that I'm used to using, it seemed to be the absolutely perfect time to be working with people whose work I admired in Srinagar. So it became it was a collaboration between me and an artist friend, and that from that collaboration it became more and more of a collaborating with artisans in Srinagar, people working in paper mache, and I think that is perhaps one area that I would now also like to take further, but I don't know where it will.
Thank you. It was a wonderful conversation for me, and thank you for your attention. I should give this back to Ashokji if there are questions, comments, responses.
Give it to me.
Well, go ahead. Always the first one is a little reluctant one, but then people take over.
Nilima ji, I have a question.
Yeah.
When you talked about...
Just a minute. Let them.
You talked about the construction of codes in your work, how your works are highly coded. I wanted to know something about this codification that you employ and how how accessible is that to the viewer?
No, I don't mean that it is necessarily always coded. But
when you and how do these codes change over time? How have these codes maybe changed over time in your practice?
I think that gather moss, something that you've used initially, then when you kind of not gather moss is the wrong word. They snowball. They from one when use of a code at one time, then you carry it into another work, then it carries the memory of that previous thing, and then so it's like a palimpsest in that way, that it would develop and grow as per the context it is being used in.
Yes.
You didn't use the scroll, the Kashmir scrolls in this, Gayatri?
Yes. Sorry. There was just,
Yeah,
Kashmir looked so large, it looked so complete in itself. I thought it possibly just end with Kashmir rather than begin with Kashmir. That was the option. And
I think those have been shown much more recently. There are other work that's not so known, so I'm glad.
Yes.
that my introduction to your works was through your scrolls which were exhibited at the NGMA, and I just couldn't take my eyes off them.
At the NGMA, oh yes.
That was years ago.
Years ago, yes.
Yes.
Those were the scrolls that Ghulam had just mentioned.
Yes.
The first 4 of those were shown in an exhibition.
Yeah, yeah. They were absolutely fascinating. The minute you enter and you get a full perspective overview, and then when you start looking closely and you see that each bit of it, the detailing was just absolutely stupendous.
I think scale does something too. And I mean, it gives one an enormous advantage to an artist.
Yeah.
Just because the gut presence of it. So I enjoyed that very much when I was working.
Choosing the scale is an artistic decision. Yes?
Actually, if we could just elaborate a little, connecting a couple of points which have come up via the 2 discussants as well. The use of the word linguistic already early on in Baroda, very much prompted by Subramaniam, who used the word language and grammar all the time, and particularly in terms of what he calls the grammar of living traditions, which means that these are living precisely because they are their grammar has the ability to I'm not suggesting evolve, but that the grammar has the energy to for its own transformative purposes, that it doesn't have to be authorially it doesn't need authorial agency, but the language itself has enough transformative power. So if we take that as one part of your training and consciousness, and the use of the word code, which I would like more elucidated in the way that Meera also asked, this code seems to be of a different nature. They are linguistic codes, but I think that you are suggesting this code in some other manner, which I'm not very clear about. And this coding is some kind of a this coding belongs to a poetics, to my mind, from what I understood, the way that belongs to language, this belongs to poetics. And if I'm correct, I'm not able to take this forward, and I'd be very interested if you can.
I think that's very useful for me also. But I think perhaps if we just take one thing, and that's the Sanji stencil, I think that might be able to. Yeah. In many of my paintings, including the first ones that Gayatri showed, and the last one that you showed was called River. Now, in that painting, I had used some stencils which are made by the craftspeople from Mathura, and that art form is known as Sanji, and they use it as a stencil, not as a form of decoration. Primarily. And so when I was painting this very, very large site-specific scroll, and I was just wandering around in the Crafts Museum, I saw these artists with their stencils, and I used them just the way they were, just marking out as Meera might, as codes standing in for something. Later on, perhaps the use of that changed, and it perhaps was able to incorporate or include the linguistic in some ways, because it then would perhaps be working not only as a code for something, but also as more formal devices of building surface, of building erasures, of building embedding things within a surface, or perhaps also of bringing in memories of previous uses and memories of possible uses, sort of So no, that doesn't really come within linguistics, but yeah.
Does it also relate to popular forms? Because that is the impression that there is a slippage between hierarchies of practice.
Absolutely,
and that
what
is what it would suggest.
Yeah, my first attempt was almost only that. I mean, primarily that. And that I would be able to add an element which was not within my hand. Another kind of... but I think that also changes, because then apart from using the things that they make or made, I started suggesting things that could be made, though I never would draw for them, but we would discuss and we would look at reference material together, and they would devise things for me. So which were more or less devised for me, though they were at liberty to use it for themselves, but it was for me. So those perhaps had another quality, like I brought from China, I brought some paper cuts. And those then I showed to this Sanji maker. And he had to actually do a very intelligent transformation of that. Because, a paper cut, the positive is the image that you see, whereas in a stencil it's the negative. So he was having to invent, so that was another.
Take that forward a bit. Isn't the Sanji more a template than a code? It's a template which you can then use.
It is a template which I was using to code. I would put it that way.
So
then what is the people tree would be standing in for a particular bank of a Jamna, or something like that. Or in that painting that I did called The Valley, there I had taken it to my mind in another direction, where they were not necessarily literally being what they were, but they were constructing something. They were not just being, say, a city was built up by little bits of Sanji stencils, which were not then directly what.
I'm pushing this, and I know that is of interest. That what you're saying now, that you take an element and you make it stand for something else. This is in linguistic terms metonymy. So you're moving from metaphor, which you use a lot in your work. This becomes metonymy. Standing in for or completing what is absent, or standing in for, basically. Now that still remains different from a code, because a code suggests that there can be or has to be a decoding, that there is a lock to the code, that code has a certain kind of there's a secret or an enigma or a riddle or a philosophic concept embedded in it. So a code then becomes another, in some senses, something which requires decoding. Are you interested in that decoding? Is that your purpose?
I think that I don't see it as an exclusive interest, but at times, like this painting that I talked about, it's not necessarily about unlocking a philosophical concept, but certainly for me it became like making a map. How do you make those codes that show you what's where? Where is Amarnath? Where is Berinath? Where is such and such? So just the map making of it helped me, would make me want to make codes. Not quite sure whether I was able to, I've been following that thing very often. I would have to think and look back. But
I was wondering whether,
Just one.
yeah. Linguists and like Chomsky, for instance, or aestheticians like Mohammed and so on, they constantly have this problem of how to reconcile the freedom of the artist, the claim of freedom of the artist, with the necessity of forming an articulate, therefore coded, a sentence or a, juxtaposition or a sfumato or something which would. So I think what happens very often is that instead of a code which is strict, there is a meter, or there is a tonal, something which has a scale of some sort. Like in photography, you choose a certain scale, and this scale itself is divisible in many ways, just like shrutis are on a musical scale. So I wonder if it is something of that nature, that is the search of the artist. Maybe the artist or the poet doesn't really succeed in getting either to a fixed structural position, like a building, or like, completely coded ghar of Ghalib, as we said. Nor does that absolute freedom get acquired until the artist probably resorts to some kind of pigeon, which then again sort of provokes the question: does anyone else know that code? Can anyone else decode? It's a hell of a problem. Thanks.
Well, I suppose with that comment, we come to the end of this evening. I think it was a very illuminating conversation. It illuminated us so much about Nilima's work and her various concerns, both artistic and philosophical in that sense. And thank you very much, Gayatri ji and Latika ji, for having prepared so well for the conversation. It was rather well structured and not difficult to decode. Anyway, and thank you very much, Nilima ji, for this opportunity you gave us this evening of revealing many aspects of your art which we would have otherwise perhaps missed. And thank you everyone for being here this evening. Thank you.
Thank you.